What I wanted to do here is just briefly outline a risk assessment process that can help manage and preserve the controls that you put in place. So across the top, you'll see some primary stages, a gathering stage, a filtering stage, a reporting stage, and then what I call a sustainability stage where you're monitoring, managing, and maintaining the environment that you've established. And so just briefly through this slide, in the gathering stage, it's important to understand both top-down and bottom-up considerations for the types of mechanisms and protections that you need to assess as part of your security blanket. So things like what are the historical risks, what are the legal requirements, what are IT's requirements, what are the ongoing operations and management requirements, the quality assurance process for ensuring, for example, configuration management is current so that devices are kept, encryption keys are changed, etc. What about the testing and audit process? And then as I had mentioned previously, there's a multitude, I think, working to be rationalized set of guidance that's both regulatory, legislative, and then as well as just industry-specific standards. So understanding those can help define what the overall inputs are for best practices that you want to, assess throughout your risk assessment. I think it's also important to understand vendor vulnerability and defect management data from vendors and then from other sources like open forums and even events like this, and just understanding, what are the risks that others have seen, what have they experienced, and what do I need to look for in my environment, or how relevant is it to my environment. And then conducting the vulnerability assessment for both legacy and new equipment. It's got to include everything in that entire ecosystem as we've talked about. And moving into the filter section and understanding the security requirements themselves, as I mentioned previously, but then finally starting to eliminate vulnerability false positives. So again, you want to get down to those things that are most germane to your specific implementation, conducting penetration testing, and then finally qualifying and quantifying risk so that you can determine the roadmap that's necessary and the prioritized activities that are necessary to take action on any of the gaps that you found through your risk assessment process. And while prioritization is important, I think just as important is recognizing that typically when you conduct a risk assessment, you're not able to assess the entire system, but you're assessing a representative sample of the key components that, through that gathering section you've defined to be the focus for your risk assessment. So you need to think through whether or not the gaps that you have found apply to other things that haven't been tested. So as you establish the remediation program that you'll put in place, that you include those components as well. And then finally is reporting and then going through and actually executing on the remediation process and then making sure that this becomes a built-in and continuous process as well. So I'll cover standardization briefly. So as I mentioned before, I think that it's, from a technology standpoint with the new market entrance, it is important to get some standardization, particularly around the security processes and mechanisms that are going to be put in place in things like meters and feeder meters and even head-end systems as well, so that you can establish, a consistent set of security technologies and processes to secure the system. And I think at some point we may even see, in some consolidation with some of these new market entrants, that there could even be a look at a certifying authority, for example, like an underwriter's laboratory that seeks to ensure that the claims made by manufacturers are in fact actually implemented effectively within that device. And down on this third bullet, talking about interoperability and security controls and compliance with regulations, there is, whether it's things from AMI-SEC or from NIST or from NERC or even the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there is a need to look at, as these standards evolve, making sure, and our industry can help do this, the utility industry, to help guide towards a standard set of regulation and legislation that is meaningful to protecting the overall grid. At the same time, it allows business to forward and realize the gains and benefits anticipated with smart grid technology. So Jesse, I think that I will pause here and see if there's any questions before we turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I will remind folks, don't forget to kind of custom tailor this webinar to your own special needs by using the question box. And I do have a number of questions, and I'll start with one that's maybe a little broader or big picture, and that is, can you give us some examples of problems? So are attacks in general against critical infrastructure, are they up? Are they down? Is it a big problem, or is it not really that big an issue? What kinds of equipment are typically targeted? What kinds of attacks are we seeing?
Yeah, sure, Jesse. I'll give you an answer, and then Rob may want to weigh in on this as well. Many of the clients that I've seen, I think the utility industry has done quite well in protecting critical infrastructure. I think they've viewed that as a responsibility for the past 100 years. And just the new technologies have created new opportunities for cyber criminals to exploit. And we have seen an uptick in the Security Operations Center and the utilities that we work with, to the extent where it's thousands of attempted penetrations a month. So, fairly significant activity. The vast majority of those are thwarted, but it means that we have to be diligent in constantly honing our defenses to stay ahead.
I also have a reader asking, how it is that you assess the vulnerability of code, since some of the vendor's code may have been written by third parties.
It's a good question. There is code assessment tools, even for compiled code, that can actually decompile and look for vulnerabilities. There's also tools that allow you to embed security checkpoints within the code itself so that you can understand whether or not they've been tampered with or whether a tamper has been attempted. So that's one or two options. Rob, do you have any input on that?
The only other thing I would say, Eric, is, if your relationship is strong enough with your vendor, you might want to consider working out an arrangement where you're provided source code, or it goes into escrow, or you agree to a mutual third party to perform that testing of the source code without having to go through, decompiling and all that other stuff.
Good point.
I also have someone asking about who sets the standards that you're referencing.
Well, I think there's at least two in my mind that set the standards. So one is your business itself. I believe security to be a business requirement, and that an acceptable security posture needs to be determined by the business. And so that's one aspect of it. And the second, there is regulation and legislation, whether it's around data privacy and the protection of customer information, for your customers that may be interacting with their home area network or with the utility itself, as well as for protecting operational systems like the NERC critical infrastructure protection cybersecurity requirements.
And we've got a number of questions. I'll ask just one more, and then we'll turn to Rob. And that is there a list of top 10 vulnerabilities associated with particular types of setups or equipment, or just kinds of attacks you should be particularly cautious about?
I guess the straightforward answer is yes, but I would also tell you that it's something that changes all the time. So I try to be careful in providing such lists, just because they're never going to be exhaustive or unilaterally applicable. So I think it's particularly important to understand your utility's particular situation. Again, understand the regulation and legislation that it governs that industry and your company, because it can be different by state. Then also your individual business requirements for protecting your smart grid ecosystem.
Thank you.